Welcome to Stay Reformed, a podcast discussing a variety of topics from a confessionally Reformed Baptist worldview. I am Jake Garrett Shepherd.
And I am Bobby Miller.
And we're back.
We are back.
We're
Season
happy
3.
to be back. Season 3.
Yeah.
That seems crazy.
It
Year
does.
year 3.
Yeah, it does seem pretty crazy.
A lot of changes over the last 3 years. And we hope you guys had a great Christmas.
We do.
Hope you had a great break, a great time with family, a great New Year's Day celebration. I don't know what you all do. I generally do nothing because I'm kind of boring. But
You read a book.
that's right.
Speaking of books.
Speaking of books,
There's-
that's a great segue.
Yeah.
We are super pumped to have sat down today with Dr. Timothy Decker to talk about his book and a look at Romans 13 and how we should think biblically about government overreach, spheres of life in general. We had a great conversation with him, and you guys are going to be blessed by it. Well, first, Dr. Decker, thank you so much for being here with us today. We're very thankful that you got to be with us, and we're excited for this conversation.
Appreciate the invitation, and I look forward to a good conversation. Thank you.
Before we begin, we always like to give our guests the opportunity to share a little bit about yourself and give us your testimony of how you came to Christ.
I am one of the pastors of Trinity Reformed Baptist Church near Roanoke, Virginia. And I've been one of the pastors since 2018, so coming up on 7 years. Actually, yeah, just hit 7 years. I came to Christ back when I was 19 years old. I grew up in a Christian home, was baptized at a very young age, like 5 years old, and it was in a setting of very, very much easy believism. And so as I was growing up, my carnality came out very clearly, and there was a point where my sin had reached its climax, and I can remember, the Lord granting me repentance and being driven to tears and hating my sin and having had enough gospel knowledge ahead of time. I had the Word of God still in my head, and I felt like at that time the Lord implanted it in my heart. So that was about 19 years old. I went on to Bible college, met my wife. Started pastoring much too young. I was too inexperienced and too weak in the faith to be pastoring, and I did it. After some time, my wife and I moved to Central America to teach at a Christian school down there. We moved back, started pastoring again, and after providential circumstances in 2018 is when I moved to pastor Trinity right now, where I am. So that's a very, very short version of how the Lord brought me to faith. It was through the midst of not, I don't want to say trial, but just a clear example of God granting repentance and giving me faith to believe, and in a situation that was less than savory.
Well, praise God.
Amen.
That he did.
Amen.
We are the book we're going to be talking about today is your book titled A Revolutionary Reading of Romans 13. Would you be able to maybe lay out some of the basic premise of what the book is about?
And in fact, you mentioned, I think, Dr. Scheider gave a endorsement of the book. I remember when I asked him, or someone had asked him, and at the time we didn't know each other all that well. And so he just wanted to be sure before he even took the time to read it, that you're not a libertarian, are you? And I said, no, I'm a classic conservative. So the name can be deceiving. I say that because the name does sound like it's a bit deceiving. When I say a revolutionary reading of Romans 13, I'm not trying to say I've got a new view that's never been thought of before. And in fact, towards the end, I kind of lament, I wish my view is somewhat more unique, but it's pretty standard among the Reformed. And the idea is that I take Romans 13 to be primarily addressing the issue of private revolution, and thus a revolutionary reading. That what Paul is doing in Romans 13 is not just telling Christians to submit to any and every command and law that comes down from the magistrate on high, but rather he's specifically dealing with the Jew-Gentile conversation in the church at Rome, and the issues that would have arisen with the Jews having a great antipathy towards Rome, and the Gentiles who have prospered would very much enjoy the peace that they were experiencing under, at that time, Caesar Nero, which is kind of confusing for many people. But the point is, the Jews were always known to be to have a revolutionary spirit. This is recorded in the book of Acts on numerous occasions. And so even the men who were next to Jesus on the crosses, they were known to be revolutionaries. And so it was not a surprise. It was part of the cultural makeup of the Jews at that time that they would engage in what I would call a private revolution, not one endorsed by a lesser magistrate, but a band of revolutionaries, a band of, call them freedom fighters, but they would take matters into their own hands and go outside of, the lawful way to go about revolution. I do believe that there is a lawful way to do it. And so Paul is addressing that spirit of private revolutionary spirit within the Jews who, as we'll probably talk about, were probably returning back to Rome having been kicked out. So as you read Romans 13, it doesn't, and it probably shouldn't be isolated either from Romans 12, and certainly not from Romans 14 and 15. Most people acknowledge that Romans 14 and 15 are about a Jew-Gentile disagreement, whether it be about days or foods or things like that, the weaker brother versus the stronger brother and so forth. And I would read Romans 13 as a part of that dissension between the Jews and Gentiles, especially at the church at Rome. So I think you want to know, what do I do with the book? Well, it's laid out in three parts. The story behind the text, or the world behind the text, the world in the text, where we do some exegesis. We dabble in the Greek, and then the world in front of the text is, what do we do with this theologically, practically speaking. So it's laid out in those kind of three sections, and I thought that was a helpful way, at least for my brain, to kind of think about the situation and how I want to address it. But yeah, so there you go. There's the quick summary of the book.
Yeah, it was particularly helpful. One of the points you bring up early in the book, if I'm not mistaken, is that distinction where, as you alluded to earlier, that the Jews were being driven out of Rome by Claudius and then returning under Nero's reign. Maybe you can unpack that a little bit, just the context of how to think through that properly.
Well, yeah. In fact, it kind of goes into why there would be more antipathy with those Jews who were in Rome that were kicked out. So the book of Acts records under Claudius that the Jews were excommunicated from Rome, if you will. They were exiled from Rome. And Paul will meet some of them on his journeys, especially while he's in Corinth. And so this is why dating Romans is very important too. If Claudius does this around 49, and Claudius will die around 53 or 54, and Romans is written around 56, that means it's 2 years after Claudius's death. And the idea is that a Roman emperor's edict, like a banishment, is only as good as he is alive. And so when the next emperor comes on the scene, Emperor Nero, the prevailing opinion is that you didn't have to uphold that edict unless the emperor made it obvious that he was wanting to uphold it. And so there's every indication to think that the banishment ended with the death of Claudius. And so now you have these Jews who lived in Rome. They had made it their home. They had probably built up a very successful livelihood there. They had a synagogue. They had formalized worship, and we're talking about the Christian community as well, that were part of that synagogue worship until they weren't allowed to anymore. But those Jewish Roman Christians that perhaps were converted at the day of Pentecost in Acts 2, we don't really know how the church at Rome began. Nevertheless, having been exiled and banished, and for 6 or 7 years later, they're finally allowed to return, you can imagine the disdain that they would have for the Roman government. And it was part of their culture. It was part of their mindset that they would have some kind of revolutionary spirit against the Gentiles. Well, fast forward to when Paul addresses the situation in, say, 56, give or take, it could be 55, it could be 57, but it's within the time frame where Rome was experiencing a decent amount of peace and prosperity. Though we think of Nero being the evil, wicked tyrant and madman, historical sources indicate that his first 5 years of reign was actually quite generous and quite good. What changed is up for debate, but the reality is that Paul would have been addressing that while the Gentiles and the Romans were flourishing under Nero, under his first 5 years as a good emperor. And so you can imagine Gentiles and Jews coming back from a banishment, slowly making their way back. And it's almost like, imagine a church situation going from traditional worship and then overnight it switched to contemporary worship. That's going to cause a rift in the church. And so you had a largely Jewish-led Roman Christian church, and then all of a sudden it switches to Gentile exclusively. I mean, not just Gentile-led, but Gentile almost exclusively was the membership. And then the Jews come back, and there's just a different ethic or a different ethos. There's just a different culture, if you will. And so that's playing into part of why Paul has to address what he addresses. He does seem to indicate that he's wanting to make Rome his launch pad to minister in Spain. And so you want a stable church that's not going to engage in some of these kinds of issues that maybe Paul had to deal with in Antioch, especially with Peter. And so it's to stave off and ward off any potential friction that might occur between Jews and Gentiles. And again, the most obvious one was the spirit of Jews in the first century and before the first century that had this spirit of private revolution. So that's why I did spend some time looking at the Jewish mindset back then and who were their heroes. They were revolutionaries or at least freedom fighters, and sometimes in a good sense, like Judas Maccabeus was himself a magistrate, and so he led a public revolution, public in the sense that it's led by a public person in the magistrate versus a private. And so there were good examples, but then there were also some negative examples. And so we worked through the Jewish mindset at that time, the culture at that time, and just the historical issues. So that's why the world behind the text gives a helpful context of why Paul is addressing what he's addressing. Why does he deal with the issue of submission to God? And then why does he move on from Romans 13, 1 and 2 to verses 3 and 4 and address the role of the magistrate, and then return to, I believe in verse 5, he returns not just to humans in general, but he returns to Christians and the Christians' duty in verses 5 through 7. So that's why the background I felt was quite necessary to address before we get right into the exegesis or the context of chapter 13.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up verse 5. That's one that I think during, if we think back a few years during the COVID era, it was preached out of context many times, at least from many pulpits. I don't want to say all, but so that verse, it says, therefore one must be in subjection not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. And I think that's a key phrase, but I might get myself into trouble here, but I think individuals in Big Eva, shall we say, to name a few, maybe the Gospel Coalition, Young Restless Reform circles, sprinkle in a little bit of SBC there. Oftentimes you would hear those in those circles say, obey the government unless they tell you to directly sin. And then ultimately that sentiment led out into love your neighbor, get the jab. And, we all kind of heard those sentiments, but maybe I think the difficulty with that is we would hear things like that all the while there was rioting in the streets during, that time from those few years there, and many pastors were silent on the issue. So maybe we could lay out the groundwork on the distinction of subjection versus submission versus complete unchecked obedience, because I think that's the problem that many of us have to deal with when we're coming to the text.
Well, this is actually a minor distinction between Westminster's Confession and Second London's Confession that does change the language from obedience to subjection in our confession, being a 1689 person myself. That's what I mean by my confession or our confession. But the distinction might be that subjection means to place yourself underneath. It could be a military term, but the idea is mainly just to put yourself underneath. whereas obedience is almost like an intrinsic value that you're already underneath and therefore obligated. Subjection does not necessarily mean obligated to obey, whereas obedience, that's the main idea, because that's what the word is. And so subjection has a notion of honor and respect. You see this in Ephesians 5 when God tells wives to be subject to their husbands, or to be in submission. And then later he ends, I think, verse 32 with, women respecting their husbands. And so there's a similarity between submission and respect, or even reverence, if you will. But to respect does not mean that you do everything that person says. And so the distinction there is subtle, because a lot of times when we do submit, a lot of that submission will be obedience, but not always. Sometimes to submit and respect would be to teach in disagreement. And this is a lot of how I felt was happening back in 2020, that the best way to honor the government was to teach them the errors that they were making. And if we did everything that they said, if we obeyed every single order that came down, and no one pushed back, then they would never learn. They would assume, and I think rightly so, that they would assume that, they must be doing things right. If people didn't stand up and say, no, this is not right, then they would just assume that they were getting it all right. And so one of the most honorable and loving things you could do, one of the most respectful things, and it's part of submission, is to point out error in those above you. And this ought to be in every sphere. I know we'll probably get into spheres later, but in the home, if I don't discipline my children properly, I would want my wife to let me know. In the church, as a pastor, if I say something incorrect, or if I do something in error, my church has every right to admonish me. There's a process for that, of course, in both scenarios, but likewise with the civil magistrate. If they're in the wrong, they need to heed their constituency so that they might learn. And that's what submission looks like. That's what proper submission would look like. And so as you go through those areas where Romans 13 were abused, I found it really interesting, actually, that that very thing did not happen. They were willing to come down hard on Christians for not loving their neighbor, for getting the jab or things like that, or not social distancing, or not avoiding the gathering of the saints. But what they never did, they never addressed the magistrate. They never did what Romans 13 was about. Part of it was to inform humans that they need to be lawfully submitted to the lawful magistrate. That's part of God's delegated authority. But then God goes on in Romans 13, verses 3 and 4, to tell the magistrate how they're to operate. And it's almost like a lot of those who nitpicked on one forgot about the other. And I think I called it in my book a double-edged or double-bladed axe. I think of Gimli from Lord of the Rings. Mm-hmm. And they were willing to wield, one blade, but they forgot that they had another blade. And so that was quite dangerous. And the other issue is the whole love your neighbor issue. And that's tricky, because those of us who were refusing were saying, I'm loving not just my neighbors now, but I'm loving, in a sense, I'm loving myself, because I don't know what this would do, but I'm loving my family until we have some facts. But I'm also loving my future neighbors, because if we were to allow this to happen, the consequences down the road could be more severe than what we're experiencing now. And so there is a sense where I was loving my neighbors, both present and future, whereas getting your jab was done out of, I think, sincere concern, though it seems more and more we're getting evidence that it was, it was misconstrued, and there was a lot of deception in that. But it was only a love for their present neighbors, and not necessarily for the future, and what that would do in a larger picture. So you have that situation. And then I'll mention one other, in that, when it comes to the idea of submission, a lot of those people that you mentioned will nuance to death Ephesians 5 and 1 Peter about wives submitting to their husbands, to the point now where there's so many different variations of complementarianism that there basically isn't that much difference between that and egalitarianism anymore. But when it comes to submission to the magistrate, it was very simplified, simplistic even, and it's just mere obedience, unless the obvious they tell you to sin. And so you had that working in the background where they were willing to nuance in one area, in one passage of scripture, but the same language, the same word, even the same grammar was used in Romans 13 as it is in Ephesians and by the Apostle Peter in 1 Peter. And I just found that to be a big inconsistency on their part, that they weren't willing to look at any of the nuances, and especially that's what I was trying to bring out, the historical nuances, the grammatical nuances, and then the theological nuances that dictate interpretation. And so that was a bit of frustration that I know a lot of us experienced. I said one more. Let me do another that I think Romans 13 addresses as well. A lot of people appeal to conscience, and I can just hear people saying, to Daniel, for example, Daniel, who in his conscience felt it necessary to go to the window, pray towards Jerusalem out in the open. I mean, he's inside, so you could say that he is in his inner chamber or his prayer closet, so he's not disobeying Jesus. But I can hear, I could have heard some of those people that you mentioned say to Daniel, just love your neighbor and close your window and pray. And Daniel's conscience would not allow that. He felt it was part of his duty in the sphere that he was operating in, probably in the civil magistrate, to openly pray in the name of Yahweh. And there were people who, in their conscience, they could not bear that the government would enforce a private matter such as one's health that had not been tested, that had no data, long-term data to back it up. And so I felt like to love your neighbor would not be to push against his conscience, to not force him to sin against his conscience. And so the whole love your neighbor tagline became somewhat of a contradictory statement for a lot of the people who were pushing that. And so Romans 13, I think, pushes back and pushes hard against that, especially at verse 7, that you're supposed to give honor to whom honor is due. Well, I have a hard time honoring someone who is, foolishly and tyrannically forcing an unproven, unknown, and now we know, somewhat harmful drug upon humanity, or to shut down commerce and say that's, not a necessary business. Well, it's necessary for that father who's trying to make an income for his family, and he's trying to, provide. Well, that's a necessary business. And then, of course, for the government to say that church is or is not necessary, that, formal gathered worship is or is not necessary, is not their place. So, boy, I haven't thought about this in a while. 2020 seems so long ago, and now you're bringing it out. I mean, I'm just getting frustrated and riled up all over again.
Yeah.
It does feel like a lifetime.
It does. Yeah, it really does.
For the last 5 years just feel like they're the last 30 years. I don't know.
Well, I think much of this book is still helpful in a lot of ways, even just thinking through the problems in our day. But
I don't think my book is going to stand the test of time like others have, Rutherford's and so forth. But I hope it will at least inform us for the next 20, 30 years, and maybe even the next generation. I don't have high hopes for my book going past that, but this is not the last we're going to see this. Tyranny has always been a problem because most of the time the civil magistrate is overseen and run by sinful men, unregenerate men. And so that's always going to be an issue. And, we need to be reminded of it, on a regular basis, or we need to be taught it initially. That was one of my errors. I never had much in the realm of being taught political theology. A lot of this was brand new for me as well. And so a lot of us, whether we went to seminary or not, just did not get much training in this. And so it's going to be something that, whether it's my book or someone else's, and there's some good stuff out there. I don't think I corner the market on anything, but it's going to be something that we're going to have to return to, because whether it's in our lifetime or even in our, a decade, it's going to happen again. And we do need to be prepared.
I'm thankful that you brought up the idea of spheres and the historic principle of sphere sovereignty, of concentric circles of the family, the church, and the magistrate. Abraham Kuyper and somewhat to a lesser degree John Knox both alluded to that concept. Would you maybe be able to give our customers? I'm stuck in work.
Well,
mode.
they're customers because they're going to buy this book.
Yeah, that's right.
Which you can find at Founders Press.
Yeah. Would you maybe be able to give our listeners that are maybe new to this thumbnail sketch of that doctrine? I know you connected it a little bit in our last question, but maybe where can we prove this from biblical texts or even church history, just appealing to whatever you think kind of proves the sphere sovereignty idea?
Yeah, well, first you want to prove biblically that there are these distinct spheres, and then secondly, that they're sovereign over themselves, and it would be wrong for one sphere to try to assert authority in another sphere. So where do the spheres come from? Well, they're all created by God, but on different occasions and at different times. So the first sphere that God creates is the family. It's the only sphere that does not involve sin in some way, at least initially. When God creates Adam and Eve, and he does, his marriage ceremony with a rib, and presents Eve to Adam, and he says, it's about time type of, situation. That was the initiation of the sphere of the family. Of course, in chapter 3 of Genesis, Adam, the head of the human race, sins. And so shortly thereafter, Genesis 3:15, God promises to deliver by the seed of the woman to crush the head of the serpent. And so you have your first announcement of the gospel, or at least the Redeemer, who would be Jesus Christ. And at that point, whoever would believe in that Redeemer would be part of the church. And so you have the second sphere after the fall in Genesis 3 with the church. And then you have chapter after chapter of sin just getting out of control. It intensifies. You go from Adam and Eve in Genesis 3 to Cain and Abel in Genesis 4. So the very next sin recorded is murder. I mean, that's quite an intensification. And then at the end of chapter 4, it's murder times 7. And that's kind of the ancestor of Cain being Lamech in that whole issue. But yet there's no indication that there actually is a sphere of the civil magistrate or the state, of the body politic, if you will. And what happens is that by the time you get to Genesis 6, the world is not filled with the glory of God, but the world is filled with violence, it says. And I think part of the reason for that violence is because there was no civil magistrate ordained by God. And so by the end of the flood, by the time you get to Genesis 9, verse 6, one of the things that God tells Noah is that if man sheds innocent blood, by man his blood shall be shed. And that's the institution, I believe, of the sphere of the state or the civil magistrate, an outworking of the Noahic covenant. And it is by man, not a single man, but by mankind, if you will, that capital punishment is to be performed. And in that, the concept of the civil magistrate, of a public person representing the private person's, we would call the constituency, is to carry out that capital punishment. And so that sets the foundation for the third sphere of civil government, or the civil magistrate. Now, how do we know that those spheres are sovereign among themselves? Well, we can look at, starting with the church, for example, that the church is to perform church discipline on matters that pertain to the sphere of sin. And you don't see, Paul or Peter or anyone appeal to the state as to how they should, deal with the sin of adultery or something like that. It's dealt with in the church. And so there's always this notion of self-correction, that the correction ought to happen within the sphere that it's occurring. Now, churches get in trouble because if a crime has been committed, they forget that their sphere is not to regulate crimes or to enforce the law. Their sphere is spiritual in that nature. And so if a crime has been committed, then the civil magistrate needs to be brought in because that's their sphere. They wield the sword. And so a church can sin by ignoring the sphere of the magistrate and trying to protect, a criminal in their church because, they've been taught to, forgive and love and be kind. And vice versa, the civil magistrate can usurp its authority in trying to regulate how a family ought to operate. But you never see the state engaging in formal discipline of a family unless, like in the Old Testament, the family decides we can't do anything with this child anymore. We're turning him over to the state. And you do see that in the Pentateuch. But by and large, discipline always happens of children from the parents. Education is always put forth from the standpoint of the parents. And so the biblical paradigm, or the biblical norm rather, is always that the family governs itself until, a matter arises from a different sphere, like a spiritual sphere. I don't think it's proper for a father to baptize his child because that's not his sphere. Baptism is a church ordinance, and therefore it comes from the church sphere. And so you see that notion, and you see the notion especially in places where say the civil sphere in the Old Testament, that there would be some who would not allow a higher magistrate to act in the place of, by the lesser magistrate, stepping up and preventing something from happening, like Saul trying to attempting to kill Jonathan, his son, because Jonathan broke a vow that he didn't even know about. And, the lesser magistrate there said he's not worthy of death. And so you do see that self-regulation that the magistrates within themselves are regulating, and they are not to go beyond that. They don't influence the temple or temple worship, or they're not supposed to. And anytime you see that happening, it's either out of an act of mercy, such as David partaking of, the showbread, or it's an act of, it will turn out to be an act of judgment when someone does interfere with, the worship of God from the magistrate side. So the biblical paradigm is all throughout. The expectation is that if these are spheres, they're sovereign within themselves and they interact with one another, but they don't usurp one another's authority. And of course, that was the major contention, and it's still an ongoing contention from 2020 till now. How much influence becomes, usurpation of authority. And so sphere sovereignty would tell us, and this is a lot of the ways that we understand tyranny, that, one sphere is forcing or enforcing rules and regulations that are not theirs to enforce. And so the ones that came to my mind would be when the state said that you're not allowed to either gather for worship, which is not their place to say. We're commanded by God to do that. The fourth commandment is very clear that we are to remember the Sabbath day, the Lord's day, to keep it holy. And I know there's views on the fourth commandment, but the old traditional view is that the Lord's day is to be upheld in the fourth commandment, and we are not to neglect the gathering of the saints for the corporate worship. To tell us not to sing would be to directly violate Scripture's command. To tell us not to greet one another with a holy kiss, culturally understood, that would be a handshake, a hug, some kind of close face-to-face interaction. And you can't greet someone by name if you can't even see who it is. And so having to wear a mask while you worship would just be impossible to fulfill the commands of Scripture. And so that was a case where the sphere of the civil magistrate was trying to enforce how the church sphere, the ecclesiastical sphere, was going to operate in its worship. Again, I think the intentions were we want to regulate this disease, and so fine, I get it. But that doesn't mean that they are allowed to usurp their authority. They might influence and tell us, look, if you do this, it's not going to be good for you, and we can take that consequence on ourselves. But they are well outside their sphere of authority to tell us or dictate to us, just as a civil magistrate is outside of its sphere of authority to tell a parent how to educate a child and so forth. So sphere sovereignty is an important part of understanding the roles of the magistrate and their limitations. And this is why I think why Dr. Scheider said, he wanted to make sure that I was coming from, a classic, position on this, not some libertarian that says we don't even need government. No, we need government, but we need proper places for these things within their own spheres. So
I know there's probably a million different directions and applications we could take from this text, but maybe what are some takeaways that we could help our audience think about? When is it applicable or allowable, when government powers are overstepping, when we should endure tyrannical rule, and when is it time to, I guess, draw the line in the sand, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, the main distinction I tried to bring out in the book was the difference between private revolution and public revolution. And it's really going to come down to if we are committed to when the last straw has been plucked, we are committed to public revolution, not private, which I think is more biblical. The question is, what is that last straw, and are you willing to see it plucked? I think it was oh man, what is his name now? Francis Schaeffer. Sorry. Whew. He does make the distinction between passive resistance and active resistance, and I think that's really what you're getting at.
Mm-hmm.
But even the passive resistance requires discernment. It requires courage and willingness to endure. And honestly, I can see, you put a gun to my head, I'm going to save my kid's life, even if that means I get hurt in the process. And so there were some who were willing to submit because they didn't want to lose their job, and they wanted to be able to support their child. And so they got the jab. And I'm not going to criticize a person like that because it's a matter of discernment. But nor am I going to criticize someone who perhaps saw a bigger picture, that I'm not just going to avoid the COVID vaccine just for my kids, but my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren and for society around me. I'm not going to criticize someone else who is, through their discernment, willing to, risk punishment, whether that be, civil punishments of fines or just losing a job. It requires discernment, and it requires courage. You're going to have to decide, is this worth it? Am I willing to pay that price? How far, what's the last straw? Well, that's, I don't know that there's a clear line of demarcation, because if it's going to be a private revolution, what happens in my mind is that the civil magistrate itself is not doing its job. And I might liken it to, I don't withhold my taxes. That is a revolutionary activity, to withhold taxes. I know that if I were to call the ambulance or the rescue squad, they would come, and my taxes pay for that. I know that because it's happened a lot here for me in the last year or two. So it's, the government, maybe not perfectly. I mean, we know not perfectly, but in minor or local governments, they're doing their job. If I had someone break in, I would handle business from my side of things as a private person, as a father in my house, but I would also call the police, and they would come out. I'm pretty confident they would come out and investigate and do other things. So the government is still operating, but at the point where they demand taxes yet not do what they're called to do by God, they are a minister of God, having delegated authority. At that point, they're not a civil magistrate; they're a gang. They are, the mafia, requiring respect money from the local businesses. We'll protect you, but we're not going to protect you from ourselves if you don't pay us, type of thing. And so at that point, that's what I said. When honor is due, you give honor, but when it's not due, you withhold it. And so you'd have to get to a situation where, active resistance happens because the civil government is not just actively harming, but also actively withholding, what they're supposed to be doing by, they're supposed to criminalize or punish criminals and praise the good and offer protection. If they're not doing that, then at that point you have no other option but a private revolution or in chains. It's really your two options at that point. So the other option might be the appeal to heaven option. And this is a scenario that doesn't happen often. I don't know if you're familiar with that phrase comes from. It was a part of the Revolutionary War flag of the pine tree flag, a white background with a pine tree and appeal to heaven. And what that means is that there could become a place where you don't even have a a civil magistrate, lesser or greater, to help you. Well, what do? At that point, all you have left is an appeal to heaven that you have the right to self-preservation. And at that point, you're not even engaging in revolution. You're engaging in self-defense. So there is that minor caveat there. But when do you go from passive resistance to active resistance? For me, it's going to be when the situation is so dire that my only other option are chains. And that, I'm not the only one observing this, but, there is a militia, there is a private or a public person that is kind of leading the way. And I feel like we do have enough godly leaders in our land, either by, common grace or hopefully by effectual grace, that they would recognize the errors and would stand up and say, look, we're not going to stand for this. We need to stand up and do something about it. And at that point, if it gets that dire, then, to arms. And, I say that very hesitantly. And I say the passive resistance very hesitantly. I had a fellow in our church, I think I mentioned this in the book, that he, in his conscience, could not bear a situation. And I had just preached a sermon on, the moral ramifications of said situation. And, I felt in some ways responsible that he stood up for what he believed was right and lost his job. And, you have to be prepared for that. And as a pastor, you have to be prepared, to counsel your parishioners through a situation like that. And, your fleshly temptation is going to be to second guess yourself when you give counsel that's going to cost your church members dearly. And so that's why I come back to that issue of both discernment and courage. If you discern that it's a good thing and you're courageous enough to endure the punishment, then, maybe that's the right thing for you to do. And so I don't want to dictate anyone's conscience on this matter. And until it became so painfully obvious that there was no other choice, in which case then I would, be a little bit more direct. But we weren't quite there in 2020, though. At some point, it looked like it was going in that direction. So,
well, I'm going to ask two more questions, and then
Okay.
we'll let you go. My first one is you've mentioned that there's other resources on this. So if someone is listening to this episode and they want to maybe study this out a little further or read some other helpful resources on this, what are some things that you might recommend that they look at?
Well, I mentioned Samuel Rutherford's Lex Rex, which means in Latin, the law is king. Now, that is a thick book, and it's not the most interesting book unless you're really into some of the intricate things that he goes through. Probably the book that I found the most helpful was, and I'm going to have to look over my shoulder to see what it's called. It's Junius Brutus, which I think is a pseudonym, but it's A Defense of Liberty Against Tyrants, or Vindice contra Tyrannos is the Latin title. I got this one from Canon Press. They put out an edition of it. I thought that was very helpful. It's much thinner, and it does deal with the biblical passages in very helpful ways that work through it. I did enjoy Schaeffer's Christian Manifesto. I thought that was very helpful. There's quite there's a number of modern ones that in the main were very helpful. Knowing where they came from, I would have some cautions depending on who is reading it, but in the main, in the whole political theology scheme of things, they were very helpful. I think Matt Truhella's Lesser Magistrate book was wonderful. There was a number of, again, I'm trying to think off the top of my head.
I threw this on you. I didn't prepare you for this. So
okay.
You can blame me.
I think Knox has a book called Lesser Magistrates as well. John Knox.
I know Knox is a helpful resource because he addresses the royalty as well as, those underneath him and how they're supposed to deal with that situation. And so Knox is helpful in that regard because he does, address directly the things like sphere sovereignty. And by the way, I should have said about sphere sovereignty, it wasn't invented by Kuyper or John Knox. Even Calvin was using the concepts of, and he may not have used spheres, but he did talk about, realms of authority. And so it was part of the Reformed tradition. Actually, it goes back to medieval theology. So it's not unique to the Reformers either, but it is essential part of Protestant political theology. So there are a number of other modern books that go through this, and probably if you're a confessional Reformed Baptist, the book that I thought was by Oliver Almond Smith called Under God, Over the People, put out by Broken Wharf. This was fantastic on just what does the confession teach about the civil magistrate? What is our confession, saying according to the Bible and so forth? And for the amount of pages, I mean, it's a fairly thin book, but he covers so much wonderful or so much material wonderfully. And I really thought that was a helpful explanation of how the magistrate ought to operate. So those are some modern books that I found to be extremely helpful as I was thinking through this. One other book, and I'll stop with that one, would be John Murray. In his collected writings, he deals with the civil magistrate, and that was very helpful. And so I did appreciate the little bit that he had to say on the subject too. So John Murray is usually a good resource to go to.
Well, here's the last one, and hopefully this one's an easy one. We want to give you the floor, as if we haven't already for the whole other time. You did all the talking. So, but now we just want to give you the opportunity to platform any resources you're involved in. How many schools are you involved with teaching and other?
I teach for Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary and International Reformed Baptist Seminary. There is a school here in Roanoke, but I haven't taught for them in a while, Blue Ridge Institute for Theological Education. But I do teach for these institutions, and it is a privilege that I really appreciate the opportunity. And so as long as I'm able and, my church duties allow, then, I'd love to continue doing that.
Well, are there any other resources or works that you've got that you want to tell our listeners about? We'll highly recommend whatever you say that all of our listeners go buy and do, and whatever you command of them, we'll make sure.
Well, that book over there on the shelf.
Yeah, that's right.
That people need to pick that up. That's a good one.
I try not to do much self-promotion, so I'll let you show people what to purchase and not purchase. There's so much good information out there. My endorsement would be ask your pastor and say, Pastor, what should I be reading? Give me some good resources. When in doubt, read a Puritan, and that's my endorsement.
When in doubt, read a Puritan.
That's a
that's a great endorsement.
That's great. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Decker, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation for me, and I know it's going to be great for our listeners.
I appreciate you having me. It was fun to be on.
Well, thank you guys for tuning in today. Make sure that you do order Dr. Decker's book. I think it was a super helpful read, not just thinking retrospectively about what happened in our nation over the past few years, but honestly where we're going, and just to think biblically about what the role of the government is in our lives. So we hope until next time that you will stay informed and stay reformed. Soli Deo Gloria.
Thank you all for listening. We hope that this has been edifying for you, and if it has, we would love for you to share it with someone, and then make sure that you like or subscribe to our show on whatever podcast platform that you use. You can also check us out and give us a like or a follow on X and Instagram at Stay Reformed, and Facebook.com/StayReformedPodcast. You can send comments or suggestions to contact@StayReformed.com. We'll see y'all next Monday.
And until then, make sure you stay informed and stay reformed. Soli Deo Gloria.